Melatonin is a chief regulator of your body's circadian rhythm. And the circadian rhythm is basically the synchronicity that the body... There's a couple of misconceptions about melatonin that I'd like to address that get thrown around a lot online, and they're the things that come up the most when people query or have concerns about using melatonin to support their sleep. And the number one thing, which is... Okay, everyone, welcome back to another one of my solo-sodes. I am now going to refer to them as. I heard someone else say that the other day and I thought that sounded cool, so I'm going to steal it. It's awesome to be able to have this platform to speak on just topics that myself and Victory Men's Health have determined worthwhile for people to learn a bit more about, whether you like it or not. Today I'm going to be speaking about melatonin. And when I did my last speaking trip through the US, I joked with my wife when I got back that I think I spoke more about melatonin than I spoke about testosterone. And this was not my decision. It was because this was the topic that I was asked just as much about, if not more about, than testosterone when I did a variety of different podcasts or at these roundtable breakaways at the Silverback Summit. And this was really interesting to me for a couple of reasons. One, for me, was because I didn't really have much of a personal or professional interest in melatonin up until about 6 or 9 months prior to this trip. And I also found it interesting because I didn't expect that there would be so much interest or demand for further knowledge on melatonin. And when I was reflecting on why this might be the case, I figured there was probably 2 to 3 reasons. One is that there is more of a movement towards people being concerned about their mortality, i.e. people wanting to live longer, people wanting to look at early prophylactic, meaning preventative measures that they can take, in their 30s and 40s to allow them to ideally and hopefully live a longer or better life in their later years. But I also think that the other couple of reasons are because melatonin has gotten a bunch of bad press. So when people have seen me speaking very positively about it, they're often saying, well, this guy said this and you said that, so what's going on here? Which is a very reasonable question to have, especially when the people who are speaking negatively about it a lot of the time have some pretty big either credentials or social proof. But I think one of the bigger reasons, or maybe the number one reason, is that people are having trouble sleeping. And not being able to sleep sucks. I've had poor sleep most of my life. And in the recent years, it's been due to injuries and pain. But even in my youth, before I knew about how to, regulate the mental chatter in my head, switch my mind off at the end of the day, or before I realized that playing video games until 8:30 p.m. and then going to bed at 8:35 p.m. maybe wasn't the best sleep hygiene routine for a teenager, but you know what you know at the time when you know it. But when I speak to a lot of my clients, or when I review patients through my various clinics, sleep disturbances or issues with sleep onset, meaning difficulty falling asleep, comes up pretty damn often. And I think there's a number of reasons for this. I think that this is going to become more of a growing concern in the coming years because as technology becomes more addictive, it also has more utility as well. You can do more stuff on your screen than you used to be able to because the screens and the processors behind the screens can do more stuff, which is cool. But I think the modern diet and lifestyle is counterproductive and counterintuitive to sleep. And this kind of leads into the melatonin discussion from a couple of different angles. So to circle back, what is melatonin? A lot of the time when people think melatonin, they go, oh, that's the sleep hormone. And if we're going to call it something, I think that's a pretty good term for it. It's a bit of an oversimplification. It's a little bit of a bastardization. I just wanted an excuse to say the word bastard on a podcast. But really, if we're going to put it down to putting it into a narrow box, which I think for the sake of understanding and for the sake of, learning to wrap your head around a pretty broad group of complex topics and hormones, calling melatonin the sleep hormone is not the end of the world. But it's selling itself a little bit short if we're just going to put it into the sleep hormone box, because it does a bunch of other stuff that's really important. Melatonin is a chief regulator of your body's circadian rhythm. And the circadian rhythm is basically the synchronicity that the body has with the sun and the moon, the sleep-wake cycle, the 24-hour cycle of the day. And the circadian rhythm governs a lot of biological processes. Different things happen in the body at different times of the day. We go through different biological processes than we're sleeping compared to when we're out and about doing stuff at 9 or 10 a.m., unless you're still in bed. Melatonin is very important for regulating the sleep half of the circadian rhythm, or third, depending on how much you sleep, while cortisol is often deemed the thing that regulates the wakeful part of the circadian rhythm. Again, I'm oversimplifying for the sake of creating some basic foundations for the topic. My interest in melatonin is more so that melatonin alongside glutathione are your body's two chief endogenous antioxidants. So when we look at supplements, or when we look at stuff that's good for you, like saunas and cardiovascular exercise and fasting and cold exposure and all these things, we're looking at the benefits of these processes being mediated by internal antioxidant production. So just like there are antioxidants in blueberries or in curcumin or in other supplements people are taking, the body actually has antioxidants that are part of our internal operating system. They're bioidentical. So we can kind of think of this as if people still use Microsoft computers. My apologies if you do. If we think about the body as a Microsoft computer, which is, pretty susceptible to viruses, but we're going to be looking at something like Microsoft Office. This is a program that is based on the Microsoft operating system. It's part of the foundation for how this machine works. These are programs that were built specifically for this operating system. Whereas if you look at a computer game that's built for something like Linux and Mac and Windows, we've now got a third-party program that still works on the computer, but it's not part of the internal operating system. What I've found in my practice is that using nutrients, hormones, and molecules that are directly part of the human operating system tends to yield better results and less side effects. This makes sense. Things that are part of the internal operating system are just going to work better. So when we're wanting to leverage and optimize this antioxidant pathway in the body, which in a modern, stressful, polluted environment, I think this is a lower hanging fruit for improving day-to-day well-being, as well as looking at interventions, supplements, hormones that people can take long-term that are going to yield a benefit when used chronically over years and decades, as opposed to just days and weeks. So a lot of the time what happens when people look at melatonin is they go, oh, well, this is going to be something like a healthy version of Ambien or Stilnox or Valium or some kind of other chemical brick to the head that will tranquilize me and allow me to just completely switch off at the end of the day and fall asleep with little to no effort. Unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. If something is going to sedate you against your internal biological processes, unfortunately, it's probably not good for you because you're not working with the body, you're working against the body. So melatonin often disappoints people because, like when I used the example of myself as a teenager, they'll be on their phone right before they go to bed, they'll be playing video games, they'll be watching movies with, getting bombarded by blue light, having all the blue light on in their house. And then at 10 p.m., they switch everything off, they go to bed, and their mind's racing, their brain's overstimulated, their body is under the impression that it's still daytime out. And although melatonin will then signal that it's nighttime and it's time to go to sleep, it won't switch off things like mental chatter, it won't switch off the things that are keeping you awake in your mind or that you're worried about for tomorrow or that you felt guilty about that you did today, for example. It doesn't work like that. Melatonin really only works for sleep in supporting the body being in a state which is going to allow it to fall asleep in the first place. It's similar to testosterone. Testosterone won't just build muscle and turn you into a confident, courageous, masculine man, but if you eat well and train well and push your boundaries and you develop capacity and confidence to be able to go out in the world and be the best version of yourself, testosterone allows all those things that you're doing to actually work. It gives you the foundation in which the body and the mind will respond appropriately to how it should under stress or in response to stimuli. Melatonin's similar in that regard. It won't put you to sleep, but it will allow you to have proper, good, restful sleep if all those other factors are in check. The problem is, most people aren't interested in getting those other factors in check. They're looking for a shortcut. And I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but shortcuts never work. Especially if someone on YouTube has an affiliate code for the new exciting novel shortcut that you haven't heard about before, I would bet every dollar in my bank account that this is bullshit. So melatonin is useful to help people with sleep, but I think this is only a small piece of the benefit that melatonin can confer, especially when we're looking at hormone optimization. And I want to speak about a couple of things that I think often get overlooked. So when we're looking at the mechanisms of how melatonin works as an antioxidant, it does some really fascinating and interesting stuff with the body. It essentially acts as a bioregulator. It almost acts like a thermostat for a bunch of inflammatory and immune system functions that doesn't promote these systems just working and upregulates them in a linear fashion. It optimizes them to work the way that they're supposed to work via modulatory processes. It puts the body into a state that it should be in during this sleep time for rest and recovery. There's a couple of misconceptions about melatonin that I'd like to address that get thrown around a lot online, and they're the things that come up the most when people query or have concerns about using melatonin to support their sleep. And the number one thing, which is the most prevalent thanks to a few YouTube, I think calling them YouTube influencers is kind of doing them a little bit of a disservice, but people in the scientific community who have a large following on YouTube have come out in the recent years and continue to perpetuate a very, very clearly busted myth that was proven to be false over a decade ago, which is that melatonin will damage and dysregulate your internal melatonin production. Kind of like how if you take testosterone, your body will sense that testosterone is present and shut down your natural production. If this was the case, it wouldn't really be a good idea to take melatonin sporadically. It wouldn't really be a good idea to take melatonin unless you really needed it. It would kind of be reserved for people who are looking at, they're just flown into a different time zone and they're looking to shift their circadian rhythm, or maybe they're doing shift work, or, maybe there's been something that's gone on recently that's thrown out the sleep rhythm and you're wanting to take it for a couple of days to bring it back into balance, but not take it for a prolonged period of time because then you'll suppress your natural production. That makes sense. It's just not true. And this was very thoroughly scientifically debunked over a number of studies around 2010 to 2012, not only showing that low doses of melatonin didn't interrupt natural production, but even massively supraphysiological doses up to 50 milligrams in humans. Not only did it not shut down or reduce natural production, it actually made people more sensitive to melatonin. It increased melatonin synthesis after it was withdrawn. So if anything, taking exogenous melatonin actually helps your natural production of melatonin. And this makes sense because we are now pushing the body and encouraging the body to have a proper circadian cycle. And lo and behold, the body responds well to this. The body gets into a better rhythm of when it's daytime and when it's nighttime. And lo and behold, the body can now utilize its endogenous melatonin production better. So what people think is actually a problem, it is very far from the truth. Not only is it not a problem, there's actually benefit in this department. And I do really wonder if this is just incompetence. And for people who want to check it out, if you go to examine.com, which is a fantastic website that summarizes a lot of supplements and nutrients and molecules in the body, they've actually written a specific summary with the research cited showing that melatonin, in fact, does not disrupt and reduce internal production. This has been so thoroughly debunked that it's virtually not really even open for discussion anymore. And I do wonder if people have a ulterior motive for discrediting the benefits of melatonin, or if people are just speaking about things that maybe they need to brush up a bit of knowledge on before they come into the public domain and spout things that are blatantly untrue. But welcome to the internet. People will say whatever they want on their own platforms, and they can do so. The other factor of melatonin that I'd like to address is a couple of more niche concerns that come up when people do a bit more research. And there's two concerns in particular that I think are also worth addressing. One is that melatonin reduces the size of the genitals in men, which is not true. If it did, we definitely wouldn't be using it as often as we do. Two, if that was the case, we'd hear a lot about it. People would be like, hey, this happened to me and I'd like to make other people aware of it. It would kind of be a bit of a big deal. But the other concern that people have around melatonin use is that it suppresses the production of dopamine and increases the production of prolactin. Addressing the latter first, when you actually look at the research that's cited for this is a rat study. And there's been some very good summaries that have shown that the majority of studies in rats don't actually replicate this outcome in humans. Animal models are preliminary studies to progress things to human trials. That's all they are. But The thing that the researchers didn't seem to switch their science brains on for is that rats are nocturnal, and they gave the rats melatonin at nighttime. So this would be like giving humans melatonin at 9 a.m. in the morning. Yes, this is going to suppress production of dopamine, as dopamine is activating and stimulatory to the central nervous system. So yes, this will be a problem if you take melatonin during the day. But if you take melatonin at night, like a, I don't know, logical human being, this isn't going to be a problem for you. The other factor, when you look at the study that was addressing the reduction in the size of the genitals, which is a pretty alarming thing to be worried about, I mean, I'd be concerned about that too, is that this was an example of a misconclusion in the literature. And this is very common in science. When you actually read and interpret studies, it's very common to find that what the authors conclude actually isn't really what the study is showing. And in this case, they were saying that melatonin was causing delayed onset puberty. And they determined this not by intervening with melatonin, but finding that boys with late onset puberty had higher baseline levels of melatonin. This is because children and babies have very high levels of melatonin. That's why they sleep all the time. Now, they've got this backwards. It wasn't that melatonin was causing delayed onset puberty. It's that the delayed onset puberty for other factors was still giving these young boys presence of youthful levels of melatonin. The study wasn't giving them melatonin and showing it was suppressing the progression of puberty. It was showing that boys with the suppression of the progression of their puberty due to other factors had higher baseline melatonin production than boys who were in the middle of puberty. Again, this makes sense, but it doesn't show what people think melatonin does. It's a very poor application of the scientific method. And unfortunately, when people don't read the actual contents of the study, they just read the abstracts and the headline, it can create a bunch of, I don't like using the word misinformation, but it creates a incorrect and distorted perception of what's actually going on. So I have only seen in my health coaching practice melatonin to be beneficial. I have seen a number of men have problems with melatonin using over-the-counter versions, but these problems that men have with melatonin seem to go away when we use a micronized pharmaceutical-grade melatonin, likely due to the fact that it skips the first-pass metabolism in the liver and gets absorbed at a more steady rate in the gut mucosa lining, which is more probably how the hormone naturally secretes into the body, rather than having a huge spike in response to oral ingestion of an instant release hormone. People will also find across the board that when you first introduce melatonin or you titrate the melatonin dose up, that it will absolutely make a lot of people groggy for 1 to 2 days or up to a week. And this can be ever present for men who use melatonin sporadically because the body does not become acclimatized to these higher levels of melatonin. This may be more useful for promoting sleep onset as it will have more of a sedative effect. However, to get the long-term therapeutic benefits of optimally elevated melatonin levels that likely more closely represent what melatonin levels were before the constant bombardment of blue light from screens such as what I'm recording this on, or LED lights in the house, we're now going to be getting much higher levels of melatonin, which are probably more akin to what melatonin levels were back before we had these technologies. There has been a very interesting study with melatonin where they gave rats the equivalent of humans taking grams and grams, even hundreds of grams of melatonin to see if it was possible to induce harm with melatonin. And the study was actually abandoned because they couldn't find any problems with giving rats insanely high doses of melatonin. So not only has melatonin been shown to be therapeutic and useful for almost every protective antioxidant function in the body, but it's also been shown to virtually be impossible to cause harm with. This is starting to sound pretty good. The final misconception is that the optimal dose of melatonin is 0.1 to 0.3 milligrams, or if people are using micrograms, 100 to 300 micrograms. This research, and I use research as a very loose term in this context, was done by observing the levels of melatonin in the baseline population during wakefulness hours. This was not measuring what the optimal therapeutic youthful levels of melatonin were. And when Thorne did a study on melatonin, they actually found that 3 to 8 milligrams was what was required to bring melatonin levels up to optimal youthful levels that promoted sleep. So This makes sense why when we look at supplementation of melatonin, we tend to look at 3 to 5 up to 10 milligrams for most people, which confers the most therapeutic benefit. Now, some people do find that if they take 100 to 300 micrograms, that they get a great response. Fantastic. If that works for you, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But one of the things that I've found in my clinic and in my practice coaching men, particularly with issues such as chronic pain in the body and other autoimmune or inflammatory conditions, is that higher doses of melatonin, 10, 20, 50, 100 milligrams and up, can confer significantly more therapeutic benefit and allow people to withdraw from a variety of sleep aids, everything from pharmaceutical medications to over-the-counter supplements, and also allows them to get better quality sleep and feel better when they wake up in the morning. This is because not only has the melatonin allowed their body to have better absorption and synthesis of melatonin, which can be disrupted from chronic inflammatory conditions, but it's also having a therapeutic antioxidant effect overnight. This is a really good 1-2 punch for improving health, because poor sleep is a massive, massive problematic factor for prematurely inducing all the diseases of aging. So melatonin is something that I recommend for anyone, especially people who have trouble with sleep. And what we also find in the research and in practice is that increased levels of androgens, especially DHT, actually reduce melatonin binding. Now, this is not a problem. This is not saying that testosterone completely ruins your sleep. What it is showing, though, is that optimal levels of testosterone inherently require optimal levels of melatonin. And this is what Dr. Keith Nichols, Dr. Neil Rousier, the team over at WorldLink Medical have been championing for a long time, which is this model that we have to optimize all hormones in unison to be able to properly exert the effect that we're trying to achieve in the body, which is optimal endocrine function, basically creates an environment for the body to thrive and perform in the optimal state for a longer period of time, because we're able to exogenously replace the hormones that decline with age. So melatonin is something that I recommend virtually everyone tries. And I think that every TRT clinic should make melatonin available for their patients, because a lot of people have trouble with sleep, and a lot of people find that just adding melatonin, in addition to healthy sleep hygiene practices like having a shower before bed, maybe do some stretching, make sure you've done enough exercise, don't eat right before you go to bed, reduce alcohol consumption, all of these things that should come with the territory, people will often find that there is a significant benefit to incorporating melatonin in their supplement or HRT regime. So I recommend starting with 3 to 5 milligrams of pharmaceutical-grade melatonin. And if optimal sleep is not achieved with all the other areas in check, again, melatonin will not offset for poor sleep hygiene, I strongly recommend people consider trying 10, 20, or even 50 milligrams of melatonin, especially if pain or other physical stresses are interrupting the sleep cycles. Personally, I take 200 milligrams of melatonin. I've taken over 50 grams of not 50 grams. I've taken over 50 milligrams of melatonin before bed for over a year now. And I found personally for me, as someone who has a significant amount of pain and injuries in the body, that melatonin produced incredible benefits when working up to the 10, 20, 50, and 100 milligram doses. So if you found that melatonin hasn't done much for you, the first recommendation I would make is to try a pharmaceutical grade preparation. And then the second recommendation I would make is to try higher dosing. If you do feel groggy or tired in the morning for a few days after trying a high dose, there's a fantastic cure for that. It's likely in your kitchen already. It's a wonderful bean that you can pour water through called the coffee bean. And an extra cup of coffee or two in the morning, while melatonin is causing a bit of grogginess while you get adjusted to it, is a fantastic way to offset for the very transient and not particularly problematic side effects, knowing that they will resolve within a few days. And I would also argue that people who have trouble sleeping would much prefer to be a little bit groggy in the morning for a few days than have trouble with sleep consistently over days, weeks, months, years, and the rest of their life. So you can also check out the podcast I did with Anna and Amy at Victory Men's Health regarding melatonin when I was in St. Louis last year, which is available on the Victory Men's Health YouTube channel. That is more of an in-depth discussion around melatonin, addressing some of these points in more detail. And I'd highly recommend checking that out if you have any more questions or queries around melatonin. So I hope that helped everyone, and I will see you on the next one.
Stop doing all the things you know you shouldn't be doing and start doing all the things you know you should be doing. If people are looking for where to start, it's that. Testosterone is what creates confidence. It's what gives the capacity for leadership. It's what drives the ability for one to become courageous and competent in their skill set. If you go on TRT and then live a lifestyle that you would never have those levels in the first place, your blood's going to get really